Donald Trump wants to overthrow the central bank of the USA and is asking the Supreme Court now whether Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, can be dismissed. This is a massive blow and means that the next source of money printing is being prepared here, which will also massively boost Bitcoin. Donald Trump now wants the interest rate cuts. We also have new inflation data, which also suggests that the Fed could finally lower the interest rates. Donald Trump has repeatedly said, Jerome Powell, lower the interest rates, lower the interest rates. We also know between the lines that Donald Trump does not like Jerome Powell. And now he is asking the Supreme Court, at least according to Bloomberg sources, if Jerome Powell can be dismissed. That's a heavy blow. We are looking at the inflation data, which tend to look bullish. And we are also looking into why there are new allegations of manipulation. A new video that is supposed to reveal that Donald Trump is manipulating the stock markets. But first, let's look at the new inflation data in the USA. The consumer price index inflation in March drops to 2.4%, which is below the expectations of 2.5%. So very, very good here. JD Vans and many people have commented, hey, awesome, awesome. Here, the core inflation of the consumer price index drops to 2.8%, which is below the expectations of 3%. So again, very, very good. This is the second consecutive monthly decline in both overall and core inflation of the consumer price index. We now have the lowest core inflation rate of the consumer price index in 4 years. And we know that when inflation goes down, the Fed can potentially print more money because the Fed has to ensure that inflation is under control. And if inflation is under control, then there's really nothing against a money printing spree. You can also see it quite well in the chart here. That inflation in the last 3 months here in the USA has decreased by 60 basis points. Since the arrow here, you can see how it goes down very, very nicely. We are now almost back to a level from 2021. And actually, one would expect that Bitcoin would rise due to this data, that the stock markets would rise due to this data. But we have now seen the opposite, that Bitcoin hasn't risen massively or hasn't really reacted at all. The stock markets also haven't really reacted. Some even reacted negatively, because now people are not pricing in an interest rate cut, but rather they are pricing in an extended trade war. Because if the inflation numbers continue to be good, then Donald Trump can continue to spread chaos in the market, can continue the tariff conflict. That means, yes, on one side from the central bank, visibly this is bullish, but from the trade conflict side, the market actually assesses it as more bearish. Howard Lutnick, the trade minister, says that the golden age is approaching. We are determined to protect our interests, engage in global negotiations, and strengthen our economy. That was the direct response to the inflation data, and the White House has also shared it. So he assumes that this will lead to money, the economy, and so on, everything going up. That means that was one story with the inflation data. And now comes the big shocker here with Donald Trump that he wants to fire the Fed chief. And there have always been speculations about this. And I have always said that. I said, hey, Donald Trump wants to fire him. Donald Trump wants to cut him off. Up until now, these were all conspiracy theories and such. And now the next conspiracy theory is very, very likely. Also true here. Because Donald Trump's very, very big goal is, yes, to bring down the interest rates here. And in the long run, he can somewhat control that. Maybe also with the Department of Government Efficiency, although interest rates have gone up here as well. But in the short term, he simply needs a Fed chief who will play along. And Jerome Powell is currently not playing along, even though Donald Trump keeps saying, hey, finally lower the interest rates, the inflation data is good, the job data is good. There is no longer any reason to keep the interest rates high here. According to Bloomberg, President Donald Trump has requested the U.S. Supreme Court to allow him to dismiss senior officials of 2 independent agencies. But on the other, it doesn't have to only concern the Fed, but it could also involve another agency. The case examines a 90-year-old Supreme Court ruling that allows Congress to protect senior officials from being dismissed by the president. Because Jerome Powell and the Fed are somewhat separate from Donald Trump here. So Donald Trump actually doesn't have any direct influence. That's why it's now being reviewed to see if there's a way he can do it after all. And I've mentioned this in old videos before. Donald Trump will surely find some means to dismiss Jerome Powell. And he has somehow struggled with it. Now he has tried this way or is apparently attempting this path. Maybe it will work this way. That means, yes, the outcome could determine whether Trump is allowed to dismiss the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. And it could also have implications for the job security of other agency heads. So that means Jerome Powell is not yet de facto dismissed. This is supposed to be reviewed. And if that goes through, then Donald Trump could dismiss Jerome Powell, possibly also other agencies or offices that he doesn't favor as much. On one hand, there are people who say, hey, this needs to be independent. Donald Trump can't just do that here. Somehow swap out the monetary policy, or let's say the people involved in monetary policy, so that it runs according to his wishes. The next point of criticism here is that it is generated by Bloomberg AI. That means there are now a lot of people who have shared this, saying, okay, this is basically an official document. But if you look closely, it's just Bloomberg AI here. And now it's a matter of interpretation. whether Jerome Powell is really meant here. Sure, it says that Jerome Powell is basically the person involved, whom Donald Trump wants to dismiss. I also strongly assume that, but it's not an official confirmation. It's basically just an interpretation of what Donald Trump is doing here, because he's asking the Supreme Court if he can dismiss two people. And what is being interpreted here by Bloomberg AI and other people is just their own interpretation. But that is no official confirmation. Donald Trump hasn't officially said here, please dismiss Jerome Powell. But as I said, if you ask me, this is a very clear matter. This is about Jerome Powell and not about any other offices. This is also confirmed here by Marty. He says, in my opinion, Trump is asking the Supreme Court if he can dismiss Jerome Powell. Just as I am saying, Trump wants to immediately dismiss high-ranking officials of two independent agencies. The clause is used in quotes for important reason in the current legislation. So if there is any important reason, then they can apparently be dismissed. If there is no important reason, then they cannot be dismissed. It involves a 90-year-old case where Congress shields high-ranking incumbent officials. In my opinion, it means here that the goal is the dismissal of Jerome Powell. Other officials could also be dismissed. The case still needs to be approved by the Supreme Court judges. But it is clear. I have called it anti-FED. Elon Musk also says anti-FED. And Elon Musk is a big ally of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, cannot quite officially say it. That means what Donald Trump cannot officially say, Elon Musk often says. And accordingly, it is probably true that he will dismiss Jerome Powell, or wants to, even if it might not be completely officially approved or confirmed yet. And what would that mean for Bitcoin? For Bitcoin, it would mean money printer go BRRR, and money printer go BRRR means for Bitcoin that more liquidity will enter the market, that Bitcoin will break out upwards, that stocks will break out upwards, risk assets, that we will finally move from a risk-off sentiment to a risk-on sentiment. That means everything is very, very positive. And now I'm actually going to show you a clip where it becomes very clear that Donald Trump wants to overthrow the Federal Reserve. Please listen very carefully to the date he mentions here. He always mentions the date, 1913. He doesn't directly mention the Federal Reserve here, nor does he mention Jerome Powell, but he always talks about the date, 1913. And in 1913, something very, very specific happened, namely the Federal Reserve was founded. That means he's actually talking about something else, but he means the Federal Reserve. And let's take a look at the clip.
America is going to be very rich again, and it's going to happen very quickly. It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before. Do you know the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking. In other words, relatively. And they set up the Great Tariff Commission of 1887.
Built in 1887. So he's saying here, it's time to get the USA back on the path to success, to connect to the system that worked very, very well before, here from the 1870s to 1913. And then he goes on about the tariffs, specifically the duties. And yes, that might be true. I can't really say much about it. But what's particularly notable is that during this time, there was no central bank, meaning there was no Federal Reserve. Accordingly, many people assume that this clip is ambiguous, so feel free to write in the comments below why he keeps talking about the date. 1913, this was a speech from a week ago. He referred to the date 1913 several times. This was just a very small excerpt, but the fact is that in 1913, not only was the income tax changed, and then the tariffs were also changed, but in 1913, the Federal Reserve was also established. And that is probably the biggest turning point in U.S. financial history. Donald Trump knows this, and Donald Trump is also in contact with Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is also the biggest opponent of the Federal Reserve, just like Ron Paul, who has been saying for 50 years, and the Fed, we need to audit the Fed. And Ron Paul goes so far as to say, hey, if the Fed is audited, then the Fed will automatically be shut down, because the Fed, it has so many scandals at the bucket, it has so much mess on its hands, and everything runs beneath the surface. You don't even know what's going on there. And Ron Paul, the biggest critic of the Fed for 50 years, was actually asked, I think it was on Tucker Carlson or something, he was asked, yes, what happens then if the Fed is audited? What will be revealed? And he said, it will clearly lead to the closure of the Fed, because scandals will come out that you can't even imagine right now. And since we're already talking about scandals, we actually have another clip here of Donald Trump that was released where you see Donald Trump with two billionaires. In any case, it's quite clear here, or many people interpret it this way from the clip, that Donald Trump is manipulating the stock markets. I mean, I'm still a bit unsure whether it was really deliberate manipulation or if it wasn't deliberate manipulation. But that also happened. Then there was basically someone who, just before Donald Trump announced that the tariffs would be lifted, that the tariff pause was coming. Just before that happened, the S&P 500 went up by a whole point because someone probably made massive purchases. And then somehow 5 minutes later, Donald Trump released the news. That could be a coincidence, but you can feel free to write in the comments whether you think it's a coincidence or not. In any case, watch the clip and then we'll look at it together and evaluate it together, because this is something sneaky going on here.
This is Charles Schwab.
It's not just a company, it's actually an individual. And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. That's not bad, because, he's in financials.
So he's definitely out and about with his billionaire friends. And then he clearly says here first, he somehow made $2.5 billion in profits in one day. That means he's referring to the day when Donald Trump lifted the tariffs, which then caused the stock markets to rise massively. And their other friend here made $900 million. And they're somehow quite proud of that, presenting it here. Then he gives him a little pat on the shoulder and so on. They laugh together. I don't want to read too much into it. I don't want to say that this is manipulation or anything, but there are actually many people who say, okay, this is a very clear manipulation happening here. We saw it not in the stock markets, but we saw it in the chart. Now we have confirmation again that he meets with them, jokes about it, and clearly says, hey, they made so many gains. But on the other hand, you also have to know Donald Trump is simply a businessman who thinks it's great when you make money, who thinks it's great when you have success here. He shows that in America, which is also different from sometimes in Germany. In America, people are sometimes proud when they earn a lot of money, when they win a lot of money. When you make money on the stock market and so on, you show that proudly. That means it's also a different, but on the real culture, a different success culture, they handle success very differently. And from that perspective, I wouldn't overinterpret it. The much more intense story I actually find here. The story with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. And I'm very curious to see how that continues. I'll tell you honestly, even if there might be some investigation going on, I still believe that Jerome Powell won't be easily dismissed, because Jerome Powell already said in an interview during an FOMC meeting in the question and answer that he doesn't want to be influenced by Donald Trump. And even if Donald Trump wants him to step down from his position, he will just continue as he is. So Jerome Powell is definitely holding his ground here. This is a very interesting power play. In any case, if you want to buy Bitcoin now, I'll put a link below for you. 21 Bitcoin, where you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. And if you're looking for an optimal hardware wallet, I'll also include a link to a TREZOR hardware wallet. Here you can manage your Bitcoin self-sovereignly without third-party risk, exchange risk, ETF risk, or whatever. This is a must-have for every Bitcoin OG. Anyone who really wants to be self-sovereign here. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you also get a 10% discount on such a hardware wallet. Guys, see you.